Which root factions are the most popular? I created a community-wide poll to find out. In the poll, players were asked to rank each of the 10 root factions in order of how much they enjoy playing as them. Over 250 responses were collected, and the results will be shared in this video. Factions scored 10 points for being ranked first in a list, 9 points for second, and so on. They are ranked by average score across all 253 responses. Responses were collected using a Google form that I posted in a few Discords, most notably Woodland Warriors. Thank you SP Shaman for allowing me to post it in the news channel, and thank you Lord of the Board and Nitrorev for making community posts about it so it could reach even more players. And just a quick note, the root subreddit was private while I was conducting this survey, so I wasn't able to gather data from that part of the community. It was just bad timing. Before I start discussing the results, let's quickly define the statistics I'll be showing you. If you're not interested in this bit, feel free to skip ahead using the timestamps embedded in the video timeline. The mean is the value of the average response. The higher the mean, the better the faction performed in the poll. It's calculated by multiplying each rank's score value by the number of times the faction received said rank, then dividing by total responses. The standard deviation is the distance from the mean of an average data point. A higher standard deviation means the rankings are more spread out. It's calculated with the following formula. The mean is subtracted from each of the individual data points and squared. All of those values are added up and then divided by the total number of responses. After all that, we take the square root and we now have our standard deviation. The mode is the ranking that appears most often in the dataset. It's just calculated by counting. One final definition here, many players that responded to the poll had no experience with the Marauder factions, so they ranked them last. Those responses needed to be tweaked. The adjusted mean was calculated by my friend Perry, who you may know from our live streams and a few of my digital playthroughs. I'm not going to read through all of this, but feel free to pause and check it out for yourself. Just as a little side note, Jamie said Perry kept saying bats and radgers, and I'm imagining him sitting at a dimly lit desk muttering to himself, scribbling some number down, crossing it all out, and then scribbling again for so long that rats and badgers have become one and the same. Thanks for helping me out with this though, buddy. I do really appreciate it. So let's get talking about those results. First up here is faction number 10. Bringing up the rear, we have the Vagabond. This lone nomad was ranked number 1 in 5.53% of responses and made the top 5 in 38.3% of responses. Unfortunately, they were ranked last in a whopping 20.9% of responses. They received an average score of 4.22, keep in mind a higher score is better, with a standard deviation of 2.88. The most common ranking they received was 10th. Here's a graph that shows roughly how many votes the Vagabond received for each of the 10 positions. At the end of the video, I'll put up a chart with the exact numbers. So what do players enjoy about the Vagabond? I gave respondents the option of including a rationale with each of their rankings. To those who did so, thank you, because I got enough explanations that I could put together a list of what makes each faction appealing or unappealing. Players that ranked the Vagabond number 1 or number 2 said the following. The variety in scoring methods is appealing. They don't have any pieces to defend. Having several different Vagabond characters keeps gameplay fresh. They enjoy the ways in which they can interact with other factions. Playing the weaker Vagabonds is challenging and fun. Personally, I agree that playing the weaker Vagabonds can be challenging and fun. I particularly enjoy playing with the Vagrant. The Instigate ability makes for some neat little tricks. That being said, I also agree with many of the upcoming points. So now let's see what players dislike about our RPG protagonist. Players who ranked them number 9 or number 10 said the following. Infamy is too powerful. The Vagabond doesn't feel like it fits in a wargame. There's a high dependence on RNG, or randomness. Winning feels too easy. Skipping turns in the forest feels bad. Most of these are pretty glaring flaws. From a game balance perspective, base Infamy is definitely overtuned. I also don't like the dependence on RNG. Even if you draft the Vagabond with a T in your starting hand, you might not be able to craft it until as late as turn 4, thanks to the randomness of the ruins. Skipping turns in the forest I'm also not a super huge fan of, but to each their own. All this to say, I definitely understand why the Vagabond ended up at the bottom of this list. Now let's move on to faction number 9. This one is a heartbreaker for me. The Marquise de Cat just barely avoids being the least popular faction. Longtime viewers will know that the Cats are my favorite faction in the game, but unfortunately only 7.11% of respondents share my sentiment. 47% rank the Cats among their top 5, while 8.3% put them at the bottom. Their average score is 5.03, with a standard deviation of 2.71 and an interesting triple mode at ranks 5, 8, and 9. As we can see here, the high concentration of 8s and 9s are what contribute to the Cats' low standing. If I know anything about Cats players, it's that they like to table talk. So let's see what respondents who ranked cats number 1 or number 2 had to say. They enjoy puzzling out optimized solutions with limited actions. It feels like their wins are earned, always playing slightly behind. They like the need to appeal to the table, cut deals, and direct people's attention away from themselves. The need for rule and building space ensures almost every clearing is contested. Cats require efficient movement and combat, and knowledge of when to reinforce a clearing and when to concede it. Controlling your decline until you can burst for the finish line is satisfying. The ability to nudge other factions out of your way or into a bad situation using just your presence rather than your actions is unique to cats. I don't feel like I need to add anything here. I love all this stuff, which is why I love the cats so much. There were many more negative responses than positive responses, though. Players who ranked these industrious felines number 9 or number 10 said the following. Cats can be completely board wiped with no way to come back. Cats have a target on their back in the mid-game and are subsequently crippled going into the endgame. They are too fragile and at the mercy of other players' decisions. Their lackluster crafting potential contributes to cat games feeling repetitive. Their set of actions are simple and boring, and picking them feels like a guaranteed loss. Most of these points are valid, but I disagree that picking the cats feels like a guaranteed loss. That being said, they're definitely on the weaker side. I think the Vagabond and cats were probably what many of you predicted to end up in those lowest positions. Now things are starting to get a little more interesting though, so let's see faction number 8. The Woodland Alliance is next up, which means 3 of the 4 base game factions are all the way down at the bottom of the pack. The WA, or WA, earned the top spot in 7.51% of responses, and a top 5 spot in 53% of them. They were chosen as the least favorite quite infrequently compared to the Cats and Vagabond at 5.93%. Their average score was 5.39 with a standard deviation of 2.68 and a double mode at ranks 5 and 8. Looking at the graph, we can see that they got fewer 10th place rankings than any other ranking, but the concentration of votes in the 7 to 9 range is what's dragging them down here. So what do people enjoy about the Green Toast? People who ranked them number 1 or number 2 said the following. They enjoy wielding the threat of a revolt. Starting without any pieces on the board gives the Alliance a unique feel. Guerrilla War is incredibly powerful. They like disrupting the other factions. The tactical options they have available in the E&P deck are fun. They are thrilled when they win with a double-digit final turn. Solving the puzzle of the Woodland Alliance's final turn is quite fun. The first root content I watched on YouTube was Waterman's series of Woodland Alliance puzzles. But what do players dislike about the Woodland Alliance? Those who ranked them number 9 or number 10 said the following. If the table wants to, they can deny a revolt for multiple turns. Their decision-making feels railroaded, creating boring games. The Alliance's performance feels dependent on how well the table handled them rather than how well they played. Their strategy is one-dimensional. While this is a short list, each point on it is a pretty big deal. The main issue with the Woodland Alliance for me is since you almost never contribute to policing the table, everyone benefits from keeping you down, resulting in the sentiment that their performance isn't always tied to how well they're played. Ranks 8 through 3 are all fairly tight, so let's find out which faction barely beat out the Woodland Alliance. Coming in at rank number 7 is the Corvid Conspiracy. They were ranked number 1 in a respectable 10.7% of responses and made the top 5 in 52.6%. They ended up at the bottom of 11.1% of lists. Their average score was 5.42, their standard deviation was 2.94, and we can already see the reason why. With double-digit percentages on both ends of the spectrum, this was quite the controversial faction. Funnily enough though, their mode was smack dab in the middle at rank number 5. I find these visualizations really interesting. What accounts for the drop-off at rank 4 specifically? Maybe it's simply that lots of players feel they are top 3 and a few more feel they are middle of the pack, but neither of these categories include rank 4. Let's talk about what players like about the Corvids. Players who ranked them number 1 or number 2 said the following. They enjoy the mind games and destructive potential of plots. Crafting frequently is enjoyable and creates more strategic possibilities. It is refreshing not to have to worry about rule. Winning as the underdog feels great. Corvid recruiting allows them access to any clearing they want. I really enjoy amassing a bunch of crafted improvements with the Corvids. They have a few unique interactions thanks to their birdsong crafting, most notably the ability to immediately use false orders after crafting it, which is really threatening. So what are some of the issues the community has with these Masters of Deception? Players who ranked them number 9 or number 10 said the following. Corvids are too weak, because their scoring method is interrupted too easily, they don't have enough actions, exposure is too easy, and embedded agents is not really a deterrent. They don't enjoy bluffing, and the game plan feels too rigid. It definitely is a shame that the Corvids are as weak as they are, but as you can tell from my love of cats, faction strength doesn't tend to bother me that much. It's generally a lack of agency that puts me off of factions, and Corvids can scrape together a decent fighting force and make some impactful plays, so I enjoy playing them, right up until about 24 points into the game. They have such a hard time closing. Which faction is behind door number 6? Earning a higher rank than I ever expected they would, it's the Underground Duchy. They just missed out on getting 10% favorites, coming in at 9.49%. They made it into the top 5 in 51.4% of rankings and fell to the very bottom 7.91% of the time. Their average score was 5.46, putting them just ahead of the Corvids. Their standard deviation was on the lower end at 2.78, and their mode was the highest we've seen so far at rank number 4. This time it's rank number 5 that our respondents seemed not to favor, with a small second peak occurring at rank number 7. What about the Duchy's hierarchy earned them this spot? Players who ranked them number 1 or number 2 said the following. They enjoy the steady increase in action economy. There are a variety of strategies to choose from, and the swaying mechanic provides strategic flexibility. Mole endgames are satisfying to puzzle out, the burrow provides unique movement options, and a win never seems truly out of reach for the moles. Like with the Woodland Alliance, I do enjoy figuring out the endgame puzzle with the moles. I'm not sure I agree that a win never seems truly out of reach for them, but they are definitely capable of accomplishing a lot with very few pieces on the board, which in this case is something I'm not a huge fan of. What do people dislike about playing the moles? Players who ranked them number 9 or number 10 said the following. Moles are too strong. Turtling is encouraged. The smole to swole strategy makes them a one-trick faction. Endgame mole turns are a mess to plan out. It's not fun to be the one in a 3v1. Moles require a lot of policing, which means it's difficult to attempt anything other than the most efficient and boring strategies. I agree that smole to swole can grow stale after several games, but it's this in combination with the final bullet point that drags them down the list for me. When you're playing against experienced players, you're not afforded the tools to do anything but play small mole, and you shouldn't be, since a large clump of moles guarding a couple of buildings is terrifyingly strong when those buildings are allowed to stand. We've already made it to the top half of the list. Which faction is number 5? The Lizard Cult has converted the hearts of many a player on its way to rank number 5 with an impressive 12.3% of respondents ranking them number 1. Almost exactly half of the responses had the Lizards in the top 5, and 8.7% put them at rank number 10. Their average score of 5.47 puts them in the top half of this list by 1/100th of a point, and their standard deviation of 2.89 and shocking rank number 1 mode illustrate just how polarizing this faction is. The Lizards received over 30 rank 1 votes. Aside from a dip at 4 and 5 and a minor peak at 8, the votes decrease at a fairly steady rate from there. With an overall rank of 5th, how did the Lizards get so many rank 1 votes? Well, like with any cult, they have a group of incredibly devoted followers. These devoted players, who ranked them number 1 or number 2, said the following. Their limitations create lots of strategic potential. They enjoy using conspiracies to interfere with opponents. Unconventional and goofy playstyles are their favorite. Wins are rare and satisfying. The faction is very thematic. They prefer not to battle. Okay, I'll just come out and say it. I have a hard time enjoying playing as the Lizards most of the time. It all comes back to that lack of agency. That being said, I do feel quite accomplished when I pull off a Lizard win, and I enjoy those games where, despite being policed heavily the turn prior, I'm able to sneak across the finish line by using all the acolytes I've accumulated. What about those who haven't drunk the Kool-Aid? Players who ranked them number 9 or number 10 said the following. They get bullied too easily and can't fight back unless the outcast is in their favor. The lack of options for interacting with the other factions is unappealing. Crafting is too restrictive. They are too reliant on drawing the right cards. Drilling down a little further on that lack of options for interacting with other factions, I find the lack of options for movement to be particularly painful. Maybe I'm a hypocrite for loving the cats because of how much they have to do with their limited action economy, but not liking the lizards at all despite them falling into a similar category of trying to accomplish a lot with a little. I don't know. That brings us to faction number 4. The Riverfolk Company sails out ahead of all of our previous factions with 13.4% of respondents ranking them as their favorite. They had a relatively underwhelming 49% of lists that placed them in the top 5, and 7.91% had them in the 10th position. Their average score came out to be 5.56, with a standard deviation of 2.85 and double mode at ranks number 1 and number 6. This graph is all over the place, with two pretty significant dips at 2 and 5 and a large peak at 6. Just how were these salesfolk able to charm their way to the number 4 spot? Players who ranked them number 1 or number 2 said the following: "They add a new dimension to your table talk. The efficiency puzzle is fun to tackle. They have high interaction with the other factions. Otters require the player to understand each of the factions in the game at a high level in order to more effectively sell services. It's fun to attempt greedy strategies with them." I do really enjoy putting myself in the shoes of other factions when attempting to sell services. It's a skill that helps you see the game more clearly overall, but is critical for playing the Otters effectively. As a Cats fan, I love table talking, and Otters participate in a lot of table talk as well. Players who ranked the Otters number 9 or number 10 said the following: "They are too dependent on others interacting with them, and opponents don't buy their services. The salesperson role does not appeal to them. Otters' impact on the game feels limited. It's difficult to play efficiently with them." It certainly is difficult to play efficiently with the Otters, and a good amount of that, in my opinion anyway, comes from what's on their player board. Dividends looks like a good way to score points at first, but ends up being a trap in most situations. Export is almost completely useless, and the recruit action has an incredibly steep cost, which isn't really the case for any other faction. It's easy to see how players can end up bouncing off of the Otters after their first play or two. We've made it to the top 3. Will we finally see one of the Marauder factions, or are they going to claim both of the top 2 spots? The Keepers in Iron, by far the faction that the community as a whole has the least experience playing with, comes in at number 3. Of the 253 respondents, 46 didn't have enough familiarity with Badgers to feel confident ranking them. However, a whopping 15.9% of those who did feel comfortable enough to rank them put them at the top of the list. Most of their top 5 placements must have been at number 1 though, because only 45.9% of the responses had them in the top half. Despite this, only 6.76% of respondents ranked them lowest. Their average score was 5.65, their standard deviation was a pretty high 2.93, and their mode, unsurprisingly, was ranked number 1. Judging by this graph, it seems like players either love the Badgers or don't have super strong feelings about them. What about the Badgers inspires so many to support them on their great mission? Players who ranked them number 1 or number 2 said the following: "The Badger puzzle is difficult and rewarding to solve. There are so many opportunities for small optimizations. Recovering relics is a fun alternative to beating up your friends. They enjoy being rewarded for careful planning. The Devout Knight's ability is a well-designed double-edged sword, and winning by a burst of recovery points is satisfying." I've played the Badgers 4 or 5 times at this point, and the amount of brain burn I feel when piloting them is so much higher than with any other faction. But that's a great thing. I love root puzzles, and the Badgers turn the entire game into a puzzle from the moment you draft them. Not everyone has taken up the Badgers' cause though. Players who ranked them number 9 or number 10 said the following: "Badgers are too complex. It will often be the case that if the table wants any chance of beating the Badgers, they'll need to completely board wipe them. The ability to race to 30 points so quickly means Badgers avoid entanglement as much as possible. The randomized relic values make things feel too luck-based." That second bullet point is my biggest issue with these guys. It's reminiscent of the Vagabond and the Moles, a faction with such potent scoring that the table has no choice but to beat them into a pulp. Turns where the Badger player gets forced into attempting to kill their lone Badger that is trapped in a clearing with no building slots are satisfying for the table to pull off, but frustrating for the Badger player to experience. That said, I like the Badgers as a 3v1 faction a lot more than the Moles or Vagabond. Before I go ahead and reveal the number 2 faction and by process of elimination the number 1 faction, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you've watched this far and are enjoying the video, it would help out a lot if you left a like. Thanks! And without any further ado, the Lord of the Hundreds claims the number 2 spot on our list. Of the 253 respondents, 32 of them didn't have enough familiarity with the Rats to feel confident ranking them, with a serviceable 9.95% of respondents ranking the Rats as their favorite faction, but a sizable 61.2% putting them in the top 5, and a meager 2.71% leaving them at the bottom. They've put together an average score of 6.29, which blows third place completely out of the water. They have quite a low standard deviation at 2.47 and ended up with rank number 3 as their mode. The hundreds got quite a few votes in the 2 to 3 range, along with a spike at rank 7 that is almost high enough to be the mode. Fewer players ranked the Lord of the Hundreds 10th than ranked any other faction in any position, even when accounting for the fact that fewer players ranked the Rats than ranked only the pre-Marauder factions. What does the mob have to say about what makes their fearless warlords so great? Players who ranked them number 1 or number 2 said the following: they enjoy a hyper-aggressive playstyle. It's good to have agency and ability to police. Rats are a great way to force interaction with the table. The slow pace of scoring requires constant, calculated risk-taking. The mood mechanic is clever and gives the faction great replayability. The warlord demands the table's attention. I especially enjoy the entanglement that the Rats create in games, as well as how they give an option for punishing cavalier item crafting that doesn't involve putting the Vagabond in the game. Some players refuse to bend the knee to the warlord. Those who ranked the Rats number 9 or number 10 said the following: constantly changing moods makes for convoluted turns. Their strategy feels too straightforward. Rats feel too powerful. Mobs don't make much sense thematically. I do like how the mobs spread randomly. It feels very on brand, but that does mean that they don't get used as often as I'd like. If your table feels like Rats are too powerful, I would recommend avoiding crafting items for them to loot early in the game, especially prowess items. I'd also make sure to pick off weaker strongholds when possible, and most importantly, disrupt oppression as much as possible. They're great at battling, but not the best at scoring. And that brings us to our number 1 root faction. I absolutely love their design and agree that they are deserving of the top spot. The Eyrie Dynasties have come out on top. 12.3% of players ranked them number 1, and a whopping 2/3 of players put them in the top 5. 3.95% put them at the bottom of the list, making for an average score of 6.31, just barely beating out the Rats. Consistency is what allows the Eyrie to find success in the board game, and it's the same story here, with a standard deviation of 2.59 and rank 4 mode. The Eyrie received 40 votes at rank 4, the most for any faction at any rank besides the 53 10th rank votes for the Vagabond. What's so great about our winners? Players who ranked them number 1 or number 2 said the following: they enjoy the Eyrie's aggression, agency, and need for planning. Having multiple opening strategies keeps the faction fresh. Withstanding the heat that comes from building a powerful decree is satisfying. They are easy to understand, but difficult to master. The decree gives you an excuse for battling more often. I think the design of the decree makes for a faction that will pretty much always influence the game in an interesting way. I don't think I've ever been disappointed to have the birds in a draft, and it would seem that much of the community feels the same way. Their number 1 status doesn't make them perfect, though. Players who ranked the birds number 9 or number 10 said the following: the beginning of the game feels stale. Charismatic, being the best opening leader 90% of the time, stifles other potential strategies. Winning with the Eyrie doesn't feel as satisfying as it does with other factions. They feel too dependent on drawing bird cards. Being the 1 in a 3v1 is stressful. I do wish there was a bit more flexibility with the bird's opening strategy. Sure, there are a few matchups that are good for Despot, but by and large the God of War strategy is what you'll be rolling with. You miss out on so much power by choosing a different leader that it's really hard to justify anything else. Make no mistake though, I still enjoy my God of War games a good deal. Here's a quick visualization of all of the factions' respective scores. And here's the chart I promised earlier that shows how many votes each faction got at each rank, with the modes in bold and italics. Since I've already been injecting my own opinion into this video, here's the ranking I submitted for the survey. Otters used to be my number 2, but I realized Rats were growing on me a good deal, which made me wonder if they were number 2 material. It turned out they were, and then I wondered how I would rank all of the factions. Then I wondered how everyone would rank the factions. Thank you to everyone who submitted a response. Since we got so many, the data actually feels somewhat significant. I'm really happy with the results. To play us out, I compiled a few of my favorite quotes that respondents submitted, ones I thought were particularly poignant or funny. Mostly funny. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. The most tactical. Every win feels well earned. I picked this one because it really just sums up what it means to be a cat enjoyer, you know? God of War? More like God of Snore. I'm a red-blooded American. Capitalistic war profiteering is ingrained in my blood. They are fun, but I suck. Perfectly optimized for repeated bursts of dopamine. Aggressivity. I'm over the morrow. Sells some seashell on the sea shelf. Playing them well makes me feel like a jackass. Who doesn't love the scoundrel? And coalitions. Bomb! War! It's the most fun to play. Very versatile. I love making choices and dealing with tons of actions. Moles are my favorite animal. Nothing is more cute. Hold on. The best mole strategy is to not build buildings? Bad. You can put 3 citadels in one clearing and get 6 moles a turn? Bad. You aren't rewarded for interacting with other players, you just sit and score? Bad. You have an immune clearing that scores for royal claim? Bad. No one likes them. They need a rework. No nobles before squires. No lords if you don't have a... I hate this faction. I burned my mole board.